A blizzard rages through the Montana wilderness, and through the howling wind, an elderly widow hears something that stops her heart. A crash, metal twisting. Then, silence. She grabs her late husband's coat and her German shepherd, Ranger, and ventures into the storm. What she finds half buried in the snow will change everything. A man in tactical gear, bleeding out, his dog tags reading Delta Force. He's unconscious, hypothermic, and dying. But she's a military widow. She knows what sacrifice looks like. And with her loyal K9 by her side, she's about to wage a battle against time, against the cold, and against the dangerous men who are hunting this soldier. Because saving him was just the beginning. The real fight is about to start. Before we begin, tell us wherever in the world you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please like, share, subscribe for more. The town of Glacier Ridge, Montana, was the kind of place people went to disappear. Nestled deep in the Rocky Mountains, it was a dot on the map that most travelers missed, a collection of weathered cabins and a single general store that closed at sunset. The winters here weren't just cold, they were brutal, unforgiving, the kind that could kill you if you weren't prepared. And on this particular February night, the worst blizzard in 20 years was tearing through the mountains with a vengeance. Margaret Maggie Reeves stood at the window of her small cabin, watching the snow come down in thick, relentless sheets. At 71 years old, she was a woman carved from the same stone as these mountains, strong, weathered, and absolutely unbreakable. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes, though dimmed slightly with age, still held the sharp awareness of someone who'd survived more than most. Beside her, sitting perfectly still, was Ranger. He was a 6-year-old German shepherd, her constant companion since her husband, Colonel James Reeves, had passed away 4 years ago from cancer. James had been a military man through and through, 30 years in the army, most of it spent training soldiers, leading men, believing in duty and honor and sacrifice. And when he'd died, he'd left Maggie 2 things: this cabin in the wilderness he'd built with his own hands, and Ranger, a retired military working dog who'd served 2 tours overseas before being honorably discharged. Maggie wasn't lonely. She had Ranger, she had her memories, she had the mountains. But tonight, something felt wrong. Ranger felt it too. His ears were erect, his body tense, and he was staring out into the storm with an intensity that made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up. Then she heard it. Faint, distant, almost swallowed by the wind, the sound of metal crunching, a crash, and then nothing but the howl of the blizzard. Ranger barked. Once, sharp, urgent. Maggie grabbed her late husband's heavy winter coat, pulled on her boots, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. But she didn't hesitate, because out there, in that frozen hell, someone needed help, and Margaret Reeves had never turned her back on someone in need. Not in 71 years, and she wasn't about to start now. The wind was a living thing. It screamed through the pines, tearing at Maggie's face with claws of ice. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking, horizontal sheets of white that turned the world into a disorienting void where up and down lost all meaning. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, and every step forward felt like walking through wet concrete, but Ranger knew the way. The German shepherd moved with purpose, his black and tan coat already white with accumulated snow, his powerful body cutting a path through drifts that came up to Maggie's thighs. He would stop every few yards, turn his head to make sure she was following, then press on. His ears were pinned back against the wind, but his focus never wavered. He'd heard something, smelled something, and he was leading her straight to it. Maggie's lungs burned with every breath of frigid air. Her fingers, even inside her late husband's heavy work gloves, were going numb. The temperature had to be 20 below, and with the wind chill, it felt closer to 50. This was the kind of cold that killed, The kind that made hypothermia set in within minutes if you weren't careful. She knew she was risking her life coming out here, but James had taught her something in their 43 years of marriage. You don't leave people behind. Ever. If someone was hurt out here, if that crash she'd heard meant someone was trapped in this storm, then she had to try. Because that's what you did. That's what honor meant. The terrain sloped downward suddenly, and Maggie had to grab onto a pine branch to keep from sliding. Ranger had stopped ahead, his body rigid, and he was barking. Not his normal bark. This was urgent, insistent. The sound of a dog who'd found something critical. Maggie pushed through the last wall of snow-laden branches and stopped dead. Her breath caught in her throat, not from the cold, but from shock. The vehicle was military. Not a Humvee, but something more specialized, darker, with angular lines designed to deflect radar. It had gone off what passed for a road out here and tumbled down into a shallow ravine. The front end was crumpled against a massive boulder, and the whole thing was tilted at a sickening angle. Steam or smoke, she couldn't tell which, was rising from the hood, immediately whipped away by the wind. But what made her heart stop was the blood, dark streaks of it in the snow, leading away from the driver's side door, which hung open like a broken jaw. Ranger was already moving, scrambling down the slope with the sure-footedness of his training. Maggie followed, half sliding, half falling, her old knees screaming in protest. She hit the bottom of the ravine and saw him. A man, dressed in tactical gear that looked like something out of a movie, digital camouflage in a pattern she didn't recognize, a plate carrier vest bristling with pouches and equipment, combat boots, and a helmet lying a few feet away in the snow. He was on his side, partially buried, one arm extended as if he'd been trying to crawl away from the wreckage. And he wasn't alone. Another dog, smaller than Ranger but just as muscular, lay curled against the man's chest. It was a Belgian Malinois, its tan and black coat matted with blood and snow. The dog's eyes were open, watching Maggie and Ranger approach, and a low, weak growl rumbled in its throat. Protective, loyal, even injured, even freezing, it was trying to guard its handler. Maggie dropped to her knees beside them, ignoring the cold snow that immediately soaked through her pants. "Easy, boy," she said softly to the Malinois, using the same calm tone she used with Ranger. "Easy. I'm here to help. I'm here to help your person." The dog's growl faded, replaced by a soft whine. Its left front leg was bent at an unnatural angle, broken, and there was a gash across its ribs, not deep enough to be life-threatening, but bad enough to need stitches. But the man was worse. So much worse. Maggie's hands, guided by muscle memory from years of watching James treat training injuries, went to work. She brushed the snow away from the man's face. He was young, maybe mid-30s, with short, dark hair and several days' worth of beard growth. His skin was pale, that greyish-white color that meant severe blood loss or shock or both. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrible moment, she felt nothing. Then, faint and thready, there it was. He was alive. Barely. She checked him systematically, the way James had taught her. ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. His airway was clear. His breathing was shallow but present. But circulation, that was the problem. His left side was soaked with blood, and when she carefully unzipped his tactical jacket, she found the source. A deep laceration across his ribs, probably from the crash, and what looked like an older gunshot wound in his shoulder that had been bandaged but was now bleeding again. "Okay," she said out loud, talking to herself, to Ranger, to the unconscious man, to God. "Okay, we're not dying tonight. Not on my watch." She looked at the vehicle. There was no way she could get him back in there, and even if she could, the thing was totaled. She looked at the steep slope she'd just come down. No way she could carry him. He had to weigh at least 200 pounds, and most of it was muscle and gear. She was a 71-year-old woman with arthritis in her knees. Physics wasn't on her side. But she was a military wife, and military wives learned to be resourceful. She turned to the wrecked vehicle and started pulling open the rear doors. Inside, secured with bungee cords, was equipment, weapons cases, a medical kit, waterproof bags, and, thank God, a rolled-up emergency stretcher, the kind that could be converted into a sled. She grabbed it, along with the medical kit, and hauled them out. It took her 15 minutes, working with numb fingers, to get the man secured on the stretcher. She used the bungee cords to strap him down, making sure his injured shoulder was as stable as possible. The Malinois, whom she'd decided to call Atlas based on the name embroidered on his tactical vest, tried to stand when she moved his handler. The dog whimpered, collapsing back down, but its eyes never left the man. "You're coming too, buddy," Maggie said gently. She fashioned a makeshift splint for the dog's leg, using 2 pieces of broken tree branch and some medical tape from the kit. It wasn't pretty, but it would stabilize the break until she could do better. Then, with effort that made her back scream, she lifted Atlas and placed him on the stretcher next to his handler. The dog immediately curled against the man's side, his head resting on the man's chest. Now came the impossible part, getting them up the slope and back to the cabin. She looked at Ranger. The German shepherd sat at attention, waiting for orders, snow accumulating on his back. James had trained Ranger for search and rescue before he'd retired him to be Maggie's companion. The dog knew commands, knew how to work. "Ranger," she said firmly. "Pull." She attached 2 bungee cords to Ranger's harness and then to the front of the stretcher. It wasn't ideal. It put strain on the dog that she hated, but it was their only option. Ranger leaned into the harness, his powerful legs driving into the snow, and the stretcher began to move. Maggie pushed from behind, her boots slipping, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they hauled the stretcher up the slope. It took an hour of brutal, exhausting work. An hour where Maggie fell twice, where Ranger had to stop and rest, his sides heaving. An hour where she wasn't sure the man on the stretcher was still breathing. But finally, the warm yellow glow of her cabin appeared through the storm like a beacon. She'd never been so grateful to see her front porch in her life. Getting them inside was another Herculean effort, but adrenaline and sheer stubborn will carried her through. She dragged the stretcher through her front door, and the sudden absence of wind felt like a miracle. She quickly shut the door, sealing out the storm, and stood there for a moment, gasping, her entire body shaking. Then she got to work, because the hard part was just beginning. The warmth of the cabin was deceptive. You couldn't just throw someone with severe hypothermia in front of a fire. That could send them into cardiac arrest. Maggie knew this. James had drilled it into her. Rewarm, slowly, carefully. She grabbed every blanket she owned, layering them over the man's body. She cranked up the cabin's heat, but not too high. She filled hot water bottles and placed them near his core, under his arms, against his neck. Then she turned her attention to the bleeding. The laceration on his ribs was deep, ragged, and still oozing. The gunshot wound in his shoulder had torn open during the crash. She retrieved her own medical supplies, more extensive than most people kept because James had insisted: gauze, antiseptic, sutures, antibiotics. Her hands were steadier than she expected as she cut away his tactical shirt. His torso was a roadmap of scars. Old bullet wounds, knife scars, the kind of body that told a story of violence survived. But right now, she wasn't looking at his history. She was looking at his present. She cleaned the wounds with antiseptic, her jaw set as she worked. The rib laceration needed stitches. She threaded the curved needle, her hands remembering the motions from the one time James had walked her through suturing a training dummy. "Forgive me if this isn't pretty," she muttered. "I'm a retired librarian, not a surgeon." She stitched, 12 tight, careful stitches that pulled the torn flesh together. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. The shoulder wound was trickier. It was older, maybe 2 days, and showed signs of infection. She cleaned it thoroughly, packed it with antibiotic ointment, and bandaged it tight. Then she started an IV, something James had taught her for emergencies. Saline to combat dehydration and shock. The vein in his arm was hard to find, his circulation so poor, but she got it on the second try. As she worked, Ranger and Atlas lay side by side near the fireplace. Ranger had positioned himself between the door and the injured Malinois, a silent guardian. Maggie treated Atlas next, cleaning his wounds, properly splinting his broken leg, giving him water and a dose of pain medication she had for Ranger. The dog licked her hand once, a gesture of trust and gratitude. It was past midnight when she finally sat back, exhausted. The man, whoever he was stable. For now, his color was slightly better, his breathing more regular, but he was still unconscious, still hovering in that dangerous space between life and death. Maggie pulled the dog tags from around his neck, careful not to disturb him. She held them up to the lamplight and read the inscription. Captain Ethan Cross, blood type O positive, and then, stamped in small letters, USASOC, United States Army Special Operations Command, Delta Force. Her breath caught. Delta Force. The most elite soldiers in the entire military. The men who operated in the shadows, who did the impossible missions, who never made the news because what they did was too classified to ever be spoken about. James had worked with Delta operators during his career. He'd spoken about them with a reverence reserved for few. He'd called them the tip of the spear, the best of the best, and one of them was lying unconscious on her living room floor, hunted by someone, bleeding out, saved only by a 71-year-old widow and her dog. Maggie looked out the window at the storm still raging outside. The roads would be impassable for days. No one was coming, no rescue, no backup. It was just her, Ranger, and this broken soldier. She pulled a chair over and sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, feeling his pulse. Still there, still fighting. You hold on, Captain Cross, she said softly. You hold on. Because I didn't drag your stubborn carcass through a blizzard just to have you quit on me now. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Maggie Reeves settled in for a long night of watching over a stranger who'd become her responsibility the moment she'd decided to walk into that storm. The morning came slowly, the storm finally exhausted, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The sun rose pale and cold, turning the landscape into a blinding field of white. Maggie had slept in her chair. A shallow, restless sleep interrupted every hour to check on Ethan. Each time, she'd checked his pulse, his breathing, the IV line. Each time, he was still there, still alive, still fighting. It was just after 7 when his eyes opened. She saw it immediately, the sudden tension in his body, the way his hand moved instinctively toward his hip, where a sidearm would normally be holstered. His eyes, a sharp grey blue, snapped open and scanned the room with the rapid assessment of a trained operator. Ceiling, windows, exits, threats, all of it processed in under 2 seconds. Then his gaze landed on Maggie, sitting in her chair, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching him calmly. His hand froze. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by pain as his injuries made themselves known. He tried to sit up, gasped, and collapsed back down. Easy, Maggie said, setting down her coffee and moving to his side. Don't try to move yet. You've got a dozen stitches in your ribs and a shoulder wound that's trying to heal. You'll tear them open. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his voice a hoarse rasp. Who are you? Where am I? My name is Margaret Reeves. You're in my cabin, about 15 miles outside of Glacier Ridge, Montana. I found you last night in the storm. Your vehicle crashed in a ravine. You were bleeding out and hypothermic. I brought you here. He processed that information, his gaze never leaving her face. She could see him trying to decide if she was a threat. How did you... You're old? Maggie finished for him, a slight smile touching her lips. Yes, I am, but I'm also stronger than I look, and I had help. She gestured toward the fireplace where Ranger and Atlas lay together. Your dog is over there. He's got a broken leg and some lacerations, but he'll be okay. He's tough. Like his handler. Ethan's expression changed completely. The suspicion, the operational hardness, it all cracked. Atlas, he breathed. He tried to push himself up again, and this time Maggie helped him, propping pillows behind his back. The movement cost him, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his face went pale. But he got himself upright. Atlas, hearing his handler's voice, lifted his head. The Malinois whined, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. Ethan extended a shaking hand. Atlas, come here, boy. The dog tried to stand, whimpered at the pain in his splintered leg, but began to limp across the floor. Ranger, ever the gentleman, stood and carefully helped, letting Atlas lean against him. Together, the two dogs made their way to Ethan. Atlas collapsed against his handler's good side, his head pressing into Ethan's chest, his whole body trembling. Ethan's hand buried itself in the dog's fur, and Maggie saw his jaw clench, saw him fighting emotion. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy. You did good." Maggie gave them a moment, busying herself with checking the IV and pouring a glass of water. When she turned back, Ethan had composed himself, but his hand never left Atlas's head. "Thank you," he said, looking at Maggie with an intensity that made her believe he didn't say those words often. "You saved both our lives. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." "You're welcome, Captain Cross." His eyes sharpened. "You know my rank. I read your dog tags while I was treating you. I hope you don't mind." Ethan was silent for a moment, clearly calculating how much to say. "What else do you know? That you're Delta Force. That you were in a vehicle that's clearly military but not standard issue. That you have a 2-day-old gunshot wound that was professionally treated, and a dozen other scars that tell me you've been doing this kind of work for a long time." She sat back down in her chair, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I know that someone was chasing you, because that crash wasn't an accident. I went back this morning to retrieve what I could. Your brake lines were cut. Professionally. This was sabotage." Ethan's expression became unreadable, the operator's mask sliding back into place. "Ma'am, I appreciate everything you've done, but what I was doing, where I was going, that's classified," Maggie finished. "I know. My husband was Colonel James Reeves. 30 years, U.S. Army. He worked with Special Operations Command for the last 10 years of his career. I know what operational security means, Captain. I'm not asking you to brief me on your mission. I'm just telling you what I observed. And what I observed is that you're in danger." Ethan stared at her, reassessing. "Your husband, Colonel Reeves. I knew that name. He trained my unit at Fort Bragg about 8 years ago. Small world." Maggie smiled, a sad, proud smile. "It is. He spoke highly of Delta operators. Called you the best soldiers he'd ever worked with. He was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. He passed 4 years ago. Cancer, not combat. But he went like a soldier. On his own terms." They sat in silence for a moment, the bond of shared military experience connecting them across the gap of rank and age. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Mrs. Reeves, I need to be honest with you. What you've gotten yourself into by helping me, it's dangerous. The people who sabotaged my vehicle, they're professionals, mercenaries, and they're looking for me because I have intelligence that they don't want getting to my command. If they find out I'm here, if they find out you helped me, you'll be in their crosshairs." Maggie didn't flinch. "Then we'll need to make sure they don't find you. At least not until you're healed enough to move, or until help arrives." The storm took out all cell service. My sat phone was in the vehicle, and it's destroyed. I activated an emergency beacon before the crash. But with this weather, it could be days before anyone can get here. Maybe a week. "Then we hunker down," Maggie said simply. "This cabin has supplies for a month. I've got a generator, fuel, Food, medical supplies. We can hold out. Ethan looked at her, this elderly woman who'd saved his life, who was now calmly discussing holding off mercenaries like it was a Sunday afternoon project. You don't have to do this. You could ask me to leave. Save yourself. Maggie's expression hardened, and for a moment, Ethan saw the steel core that had allowed her to drag him through a blizzard. Captain Cross, I'm a military widow. My husband spent his life serving this country, training soldiers like you to do impossible things. He died believing that service and sacrifice meant something, that protecting others, even at cost to yourself, was the highest calling. She leaned forward. You're hurt. You're being hunted. And you're under my roof. That makes you my responsibility. I don't abandon people. Ever. So you can save your breath suggesting I turn you out. It's not happening. Ethan felt something crack in his chest, something that had been hard and closed for too long. He'd spent years operating alone, trusting only his unit, keeping civilians at arm's length because they were liabilities, complications. But this woman, this widow who should have been terrified, who should have wanted nothing to do with his dangerous world, was standing her ground, was choosing to protect him. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. It was all he could manage. Maggie stood up, brushing off her pants. Good. Now, you're going to eat something. Then you're going to rest while I figure out what we've got for supplies and defenses. When you're stronger, we'll talk strategy. But right now, you need to heal. She brought him soup, homemade and hot, and helped him eat. His hands were still shaky, his body weak from blood loss and trauma. But with each spoonful, with each minute that passed, he felt strength slowly returning. Atlas stayed pressed against his side, Ranger lying watchfully nearby. The two dogs had formed their own bond, a partnership born from the shared experience of survival. As the day wore on, Ethan told her what he could. He'd been on a reconnaissance mission, tracking a weapons smuggling operation that had ties to domestic terrorists. He'd gathered critical intelligence, proof of where the weapons were coming from, who was funding them, names and bank accounts that would bring down a network. But he'd been compromised. A firefight. He'd taken the shoulder wound escaping. He'd been racing back to his extraction point when his vehicle had been sabotaged, sending him off the road in the middle of the worst storm in decades. The mercenaries hunting him were professionals, hired by the people he'd been investigating. They needed him dead, and the intelligence he carried destroyed. Without his sat phone, without communication, he was cut off, alone. Or he had been, until a 71-year-old widow and her German shepherd had walked into the storm and refused to let him die. The intelligence is in my head, he told her. They can't hack it or steal it. They have to kill me to make sure it doesn't get out, which means they won't stop until they find me. Then we make sure they don't, Maggie said. And the determination in her voice, the absolute refusal to back down, reminded Ethan so much of the soldiers he'd served with that he almost smiled. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, a wounded soldier and a widow made plans. Two dogs rested by the fire, and in the distance, moving through the small town of Glacier Ridge, a team of mercenaries was asking questions, showing a photo, and slowly, methodically, closing in. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time, Captain Ethan Cross wasn't fighting alone. He had an ally, and she was tougher than any mercenary could imagine. The town of Glacier Ridge had exactly one main street, 6 shops, a diner that served breakfast all day, and a population of 137 souls who mostly kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where strangers stood out, where everyone noticed a new face, and where gossip traveled faster than the internet ever could. So when 3 black SUVs with government plates rolled into town at 10 o'clock on a grey morning, every curtain on Main Street twitched. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle looked like he'd been assembled in a factory that produced federal agents, tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of build that came from functional strength training, not vanity. His hair was dark, cut short and professional, and his face was all sharp angles and cold calculation. He wore a dark suit that fit too well, a tactical vest visible underneath his jacket, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. His name was Kozlov, though that probably wasn't his real name. Men like him collected identities the way other people collected stamps. He was flanked by 5 others, 3 men and 2 women, all cut from the same cloth. They moved with the synchronized precision of a unit that had worked together for a long time. They weren't military, they were something else. Something colder, private contractors, mercenaries. The kind of people who did the jobs that governments needed done but couldn't officially acknowledge. Kozlov walked into the Elk's Horn diner, the little bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt obscene given what he was. The morning coffee crowd went silent, pancakes paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned to watch as Kozlov approached the counter, where Betty, the 70-year-old owner, stood with a coffee pot in her hand and suspicion on her face. "Morning, ma'am," Kozlov said, pulling a leather credential case from his inside pocket and flipping it open. The badge looked real, federal. "My name is Special Agent Kozlov, FBI. My team and I are looking for a fugitive who may have passed through this area. We're asking residents if they've seen anything unusual in the last 24 hours. Betty's eyes narrowed. She'd lived in Montana her whole life. She knew how to read people. And this man, badge or no badge, felt wrong. What kind of fugitive? Kozlov pulled out a photo. It was a professional headshot, military in nature. Captain Ethan Cross, though his name wasn't on the photo. Young, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed. This man is wanted in connection with several serious federal crimes. Theft of classified materials, desertion, possible treason. He's considered armed and extremely dangerous. If anyone has seen him, if anyone is harboring him, they need to understand they're committing a federal crime. The word treason hung in the air like poison. People in towns like Glacier Ridge didn't take kindly to traitors, but they also didn't take kindly to feds throwing their weight around. "Haven't seen him," Betty said flatly, setting down the coffee pot with a decisive thunk. "Most folks around here are locals. We'd know if a stranger came through. The storm last night was severe," Kozlov continued, his tone measured and professional, but with an undercurrent of threat. If his vehicle crashed, if he sought shelter, someone might have helped him without realizing who he was. "We're checking all residences within a 50-mile radius. We need a list of anyone who lives in isolated areas, cabins, homesteads, anywhere a fugitive might hide." Betty's jaw set. "People's private property is their business. You want to go knocking on doors, you go ahead. But I'm not giving you a list of my neighbors so you can harass them." Kozlov's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, obstruction of a federal investigation is also a crime. I'd hate for you to find yourself in legal trouble over a misplaced sense of loyalty to a traitor. And I'd hate for you to find yourself on the wrong end of a shotgun because you went trespassing on private land without an invitation." Betty shot back. "This is Montana, Agent. People protect their property." The standoff lasted another few seconds before Kozlov nodded slowly, slipping the photo back into his pocket. "We'll be conducting door-to-door inquiries. If anyone has information and chooses not to share it, they'll be held accountable. Have a good day, ma'am." He turned and walked out, his team following in silence. The moment the door closed, the diner erupted in whispered conversation. Betty grabbed her phone. Maggie Reeves was kneeling in her pantry, taking inventory of supplies, when her phone buzzed. She wiped her dusty hands on her jeans and answered, "Hello? Maggie, it's Betty." The voice was tight, urgent. "You need to listen to me. There are federal agents in town. At least, they say they're federal, but they feel wrong. They're looking for a man," showing his picture around. "Young, military-looking. They're saying he's a traitor, a fugitive. They're going door to door." Maggie's blood went cold. She glanced toward the living room where Ethan was resting on the couch. Atlas curled against his side, both of them finally sleeping after a restless night. What do they look like? Professional, armed. The lead guy calls himself Kozlov. He's got dead eyes, Maggie. The kind you see in men who've done bad things and sleep just fine. They're saying anyone who helps this fugitive is committing a federal crime. Maggie's mind raced. Did you tell them anything? Hell no. But they're going to figure out you live out here eventually. Road records, tax files, someone will talk. You've got maybe a few hours, maybe less. Thank you, Betty. Maggie, if you've got someone there, if you're helping someone, you need to be careful. These people don't feel like law enforcement. They feel like hunters. I will. Thank you. Maggie ended the call and stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. Then she walked into the living room. Ethan's eyes opened immediately, that instant combat alertness that never fully went away. He saw her face and was trying to sit up before she'd said a word. They're here, she said quietly. In town, asking questions, showing your picture, calling themselves FBI. But my friend doesn't believe it. Ethan swore under his breath. Kozlov. Has to be. He's the lead contractor for the people I was investigating. Former Spetsnaz, Russian Special Forces. He's smart, methodical, and completely without conscience. He tried to stand, gasped as pain shot through his ribs, and Maggie was there immediately, supporting him. You're not healed enough to move, she said firmly. If they find me here, they'll kill us both. You, me, the dogs. They'll burn this cabin to the ground and make it look like an accident. You need to get out, now, while you still can. Maggie's expression hardened. Captain Cross, we've already had this conversation. I'm not leaving, and neither are you. So we're going to do what soldiers do when they're outnumbered and outgunned. We're going to prepare. We're going to be smart, and we're going to fight if we have to. Ethan looked at her. This woman who should have been fragile, who should have been terrified, and saw instead the wife of a colonel who'd spent 30 years married to the military. She understood what was coming, and she wasn't backing down. All right, he said, his voice rough with respect and something that might have been gratitude. Then we fortify, and we plan, because when they come, and they will come, we need to be ready. For the next 6 hours, the cabin transformed. Ethan, despite his injuries, moved with the focused intensity of an operator preparing for combat. He was hurt, severely so, but Delta Force training had taught him to function through pain, to compartmentalize, to push his body beyond what normal humans thought possible. He taught Maggie how to load and fire the 2 handguns he'd salvaged from his gear, a Glock 19 and a Sig Sauer P226. Military standard, reliable, deadly. He watched her stance, corrected her grip with gentle touches. You don't aim with your eyes. You aim with your whole body. Point like you're pointing your finger. The sights are a confirmation, not a primary tool. She was a surprisingly fast learner, her hands steady, her focus absolute. My husband made me practice, she admitted. He said a military wife should know how to protect herself. I never thought I'd actually need to. Your husband was a smart man. They set up defensive positions. Ethan used furniture to create barricades that would provide cover but still allow lines of sight to the doors and windows. He placed makeshift alarm systems, fishing lines strung across approaches with cans attached, old-fashioned but effective. He wedged pieces of wood under doors to slow forced entry. He found Maggie's husband's old hunting rifle, a Remington 700 with a scope, and set it up near a window that overlooked the approach road. This is your primary defensive position, he told her, positioning her behind the rifle. If they come in vehicles, you aim for the engine blocks. You're not trying to kill, you're trying to disable. Stop their mobility, make them come to us on foot through terrain we know and they don't. Maggie nodded, her face pale but determined. What about you? I'll be mobile, inside the cabin. I've got the handguns and my combat knife. If they breach, I'll engage at close quarters. He saw her face and added gently, Mrs. Reeves, I've done this before, many times. I know how to fight injured. I know how to win when the odds are bad. You just need to trust me. I do trust you, Captain. That's why I'm scared. Because if you're preparing like this, it means you think they're really coming. They are, Ethan said simply. The only question is when. The dogs were part of the plan, too. Ranger and Atlas, despite Atlas's broken leg, were early warning systems more effective than any electronic surveillance. Ethan positioned them near the back of the cabin, where they could hear and smell approaches that humans would miss. He gave Ranger commands in German, the language the dog had been trained in, and was impressed when the shepherd responded instantly. Your husband trained him well. James believed in being prepared for everything, including the worst. As the afternoon faded toward evening, they sat together at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them, and Ethan told her the truth. The whole truth. Not the sanitized version, but the raw, ugly reality of what he'd discovered. A network of corrupt officials, foreign operatives, and domestic terrorists working together to smuggle military-grade weapons into the country. Weapons that would be used for attacks on American soil. He had names, dates, bank accounts, everything needed to bring the whole network down. That's why they want me dead, he said, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his eyes distant. It's not personal. It's business. I'm a loose end. The intelligence in my head is worth billions to them if it stays buried. If I get it to my command, their entire operation collapses. Then we make sure you get it to your command, Maggie said firmly. How long until your people come looking for you? I activated my emergency beacon before the crash. Standard protocol is a 48-hour window before a rescue operation is launched. But with this weather, with the roads, it could be longer. Maybe 4 or 5 days. Then we hold for 5 days. Ethan looked at her. Mrs. Reeves, these aren't common criminals. Kozlov's team is made up of former special forces from at least 3 different countries. They're equipped with military-grade weapons, night vision, tactical gear. They'll coordinate, they'll be patient, and they'll use overwhelming force when they attack. And they'll be facing a Delta Force operator who's survived missions all over the world, and a stubborn old woman who's defending her home. Maggie's smile was small but fierce. I like our odds better than you think, Captain. The attack came at 2 a.m., 3 hours after Maggie had finally convinced Ethan to rest. She was dozing in a chair, the rifle across her lap, when Ranger's low growl woke her. The German shepherd was standing, his body rigid, his ears pointed toward the front of the cabin. A second later, Atlas joined him, both dogs staring at the door with an intensity that needed no translation. They're here. Maggie moved quickly, silently, to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, providing just enough light to see by. She scanned the tree line and her heart nearly stopped. Shadows, moving with purpose. She counted 5 figures advancing in a tactical formation, weapons up, spreading out to surround the cabin. They were dressed in black tactical gear, faces covered, moving like ghosts. She turned and found Ethan already awake, already moving. He'd heard the dogs too. Pain was written on his face, but his eyes were clear, focused. He had a handgun in each hand. How many? 5. Maybe more. There'll be more. Kozlov doesn't do anything halfway. He'll have a perimeter team, a breaching team, and probably Overwatch somewhere up on the ridge. He moved to her position at the window, careful to stay in the shadows. When they get close enough, when I give you the signal, you take the shot at the lead vehicle's engine block. That'll announce we're not surprised, and it'll change their calculus. They're expecting a civilian widow, alone and scared. We're going to show them something different. Maggie's hands were shaking, but she gripped the rifle tighter, forcing them steady. I'm ready. They didn't have to wait long. The team outside closed in. She could see them more clearly now through the scope. Professional, coordinated, dangerous. One of them, taller than the others, moved with an authority that marked him as the leader. Kozlov. He signaled to his team, pointing 2 toward the back of the cabin, 2 toward the front. They were preparing for a synchronized breach. Now, Ethan whispered. Maggie exhaled slowly, the way James had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack was deafening in the quiet night. The bullet hit exactly where she'd aimed, punching through the hood of the lead SUV. Steam erupted from the engine, and the vehicle shuddered, disabled. The effect was instantaneous. The mercenaries dove for cover, their tactical formation breaking as they reassessed. They'd been made. The element of surprise was gone. Kozlov's voice carried through the night, sharp and angry, shouting orders in Russian. Ethan moved. Despite his injuries, despite the pain, he was in combat mode now, and combat mode had its own rules. He went to the back door just as one of the mercenaries tried to breach it. The wooden wedge held, giving Ethan the 2 seconds he needed. When the door finally splintered inward, Ethan was there. The mercenary came through, rifle up, scanning for targets. Ethan's knife, a wicked combat blade, struck like a viper, a precise slash across the back of the man's knee, severing tendons. The mercenary went down with a scream, his rifle clattering away. Ranger, waiting for the command, launched himself at the downed man, his jaws clamping around the man's weapon arm. The mercenary's screams intensified. Ethan kicked the rifle away, zip-tied the man's hands with brutal efficiency, and moved back into cover. One down. At the front, Maggie fired again. Not at people, but at the tires of the second vehicle. The shot was clean, the tire exploding in a spray of rubber. Mobility kill. Exactly what Ethan had taught her. The mercenaries were pinned now, forced to advance on foot through terrain they didn't know. Kozlov was furious. This was supposed to be a clean operation. A quick breach, eliminate the targets, burn the evidence. Instead, they were taking casualties and losing vehicles to a 71-year-old woman with a hunting rifle. He barked more orders, and his team adapted. They began using suppressing fire, bullets slamming into the cabin's walls, forcing Maggie away from the window. Ethan moved through the cabin like a ghost. He'd turned off all the lights except one lamp in the center of the living room, creating a backlit silhouette that would draw fire. But it was a decoy. A pile of cushions and a coat on a chair, positioned to look like someone sitting. When 3 mercenaries fired at it simultaneously, shredding the chair, Ethan tracked their muzzle flashes. He returned fire through the walls, not blind fire, but calculated shots based on where their positions had to be. A grunt of pain, a curse in a language that might have been Ukrainian. Another one hit. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of chaos, noise, and violence. Maggie fired until her rifle's magazine was empty, then reloaded with shaking hands and fired again. She hit one mercenary in the shoulder as he tried to flank around the side of the cabin. Not a kill shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. Ranger and Atlas, working as a team despite Atlas's broken leg, became terror weapons. When a mercenary tried to breach through a side window, Ranger was there, 90 pounds of fury and teeth. The man screamed, his arm mauled, and retreated back into the darkness. But Ethan was paying a price. Every movement tore at his injuries. His stitches had opened, blood soaking through his shirt. His shoulder wound was bleeding again. Pain was a constant roar in his head, but he shoved it down, compartmentalized it, and kept fighting. Because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Maggie died too. Finally, Kozlov made the calculation. They were losing. This should have been easy. It wasn't. The woman was trained, the dogs were combat assets, and somewhere in that cabin was a soldier who was fighting like he had nothing to lose. Kozlov's team had taken casualties. 3 men down, 2 more injured. This wasn't worth it. Not tonight. He gave the order to retreat. His team pulled back in an organized tactical withdrawal, dragging their wounded with them. They disappeared into the darkness like smoke, leaving behind spent shell casings, blood in the snow, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Silence fell over the cabin. A ringing, surreal silence, broken only by Maggie's ragged breathing and the soft whimpers of Atlas, who was licking a minor cut on Ranger's shoulder. Ethan sagged against the wall, his face grey with pain and exhaustion. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'm alive," Maggie said, setting down the rifle with shaking hands. "Are you? For now." He tried to straighten up, and his legs gave out. Maggie was there instantly, catching him, lowering him to the floor. His shirt was soaked with blood, his breathing shallow. "You tore your stitches," she said, her voice tight with concern. "All of them. You're bleeding again." "Had to," he said, his eyes already losing focus. "Had to protect you." Maggie's hands moved on autopilot, ripping open his shirt, exposing the torn wounds. The rib laceration was bleeding freely, the stitches completely ripped out. The shoulder wound had opened again. She grabbed her medical supplies, working with a desperate speed, applying pressure, packing the wounds with gauze. "Stay with me, Captain," she said firmly. "You hear me? You don't get to die after all this. You don't get to save my life and then quit on me. That's an order." Ethan's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Yes, ma'am." She worked through the night, restitching his wounds by lamplight, her hands steadier than they had any right to be. She gave him antibiotics, fluids, pain medication. She cleaned and dressed every injury. And when she was done, when he was finally resting, his breathing more stable, she sat back against the wall and let herself shake. They'd survived, but Kozlov was still out there, and he would be back. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. But they'd held the line, an injured soldier and an elderly widow, fighting side by side, and they'd held the line. Outside, the sun began to rise, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold. Inside the cabin, 2 dogs stood guard, and Maggie Reeves, military widow, librarian, and now combat veteran, kept watch over the soldier who'd trusted her with his life. Tomorrow, they'd fight again if they had to. But tonight, they'd won, and that was enough. The dawn came cold and unforgiving, painting the blood-stained snow in shades of pink and gold. Maggie knelt beside Ethan on the cabin floor, her hands covered in his blood, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. The firefight was over. The mercenaries had retreated into the darkness. But the cost was written in the pale grey color of Ethan's face, in the way his breathing had become shallow and labored, in the pool of crimson spreading beneath him. "Captain Cross," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Ethan, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Did we? We held them off," Maggie said firmly, applying pressure to the worst of his wounds. The rib laceration had torn completely open during the fight, and the bullet wound in his shoulder was bleeding again, the stitches ripped out from the violence of combat. "They're gone, but you're hurt, badly. I need you to stay conscious. I need you to talk to me." Ethan's laugh was bitter, wet-sounding. Blood flecked his lips. "Mrs. Reeves, I don't think talking is going to fix this." "Then you're going to listen," Maggie snapped, her hands moving with desperate efficiency. She'd already gone through half her medical supplies during the first treatment. Now she was improvising, using dish towels as bandages, duct tape to hold dressings in place. "You're going to listen to me, and you're going to follow my instructions, because I am not losing you. Not after everything. Not after we fought off a team of professional killers. You don't get to die on me now, soldier." That's an order. Something in her tone, that command voice she'd heard James use 1,000 times, cut through the fog of pain and shock. Ethan focused on her face. "Yes, ma'am. Good. Now, your emergency beacon, the one you activated before the crash. How does it work? How long until your people come?" Ethan's voice was weak, each word an effort. 48 hours. Standard protocol. But with the weather, the roads, could be longer. Could be 5, 6 days. Maggie's heart sank. 6 days. He didn't have 6 days. Maybe not even 6 hours. She could see it in the way his skin had taken on a waxy quality, in the way his pupils were slightly dilated. Blood loss. Shock. Internal injuries she couldn't see or treat. She was a librarian who'd learned field medicine from her husband's stories and demonstrations. She wasn't a surgeon. She wasn't equipped for this, but she was all he had. "All right," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Then we work with what we've got. I need you to tell me what to do. You're Delta Force. You've been injured in the field before. You know field medicine. You're going to walk me through this." Ethan tried to nod, gasped as pain lanced through him. "The rib wound." "That's the critical one. It's deep. Probably nicked an intercostal artery. You need to pack it, not just gauze. You need hemostatic dressing. In my gear, the tan pouch." Maggie scrambled to his tactical vest, found the pouch, ripped it open. Inside were military-grade medical supplies, quick-clot combat gauze, designed to stop arterial bleeding, Israeli bandages, a tourniquet. Equipment that had saved lives in war zones from Afghanistan to Syria. "The gauze," Ethan instructed, his voice fading. "Pack it directly into the wound, deep. It's going to hurt like hell, but you have to get it into the source of the bleeding." Maggie's hands were shaking, but she did it. She packed the hemostatic gauze into the torn flesh of his ribs, ignoring his strangled scream, ignoring the way his body went rigid with agony. She packed it deep, the way he told her, feeling the gauze expand and clot, creating a seal against the bleeding vessel. "Israeli bandage," he gasped. "Wrap it. Tight. You need pressure." She wrapped the elastic bandage around his torso, pulling it tight, tighter than seemed safe, but he told her to keep going. The bandage had a built-in pressure bar that she positioned directly over the wound, maximizing compression. When she was done, the bleeding had slowed to a seep. "Shoulder," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. Just pack and wrap. Not as critical." She did. Her hands moved on autopilot now, guided by his instructions and her own growing instinct. When she was finished, she started an IV line, her third attempt finally hitting a vein. Saline to replace lost fluids. Antibiotics to fight infection. Pain medication that would take the edge off but not knock him out completely, because she needed him conscious, needed him to tell her if something changed, if something was failing inside him. Across the room, Ranger and Atlas lay together, both dogs exhausted, Atlas whimpering softly as he licked a gash on Ranger's shoulder. They'd fought like soldiers, they'd earned their rest. Maggie sat back, looking at her work. Ethan's breathing was steadier. The bleeding had stopped, mostly, but he was still pale, still weak, still balanced on a knife's edge between life and death. "You did good," Ethan murmured, his eyes closed. "You did real good, Mrs. Reeves." "Don't you dare," Maggie said, her voice breaking for the first time. "Don't you dare start saying goodbye. You're going to make it. Your people are coming. You just have to hold on." Ethan's eyes opened, and in them, Maggie saw something that made her chest tighten. Acceptance. The look of a soldier who'd made peace with his own mortality. If I don't make it, you need to know. The intelligence, it's not just about weapons smuggling, it's bigger. There's a domestic terror cell, funded by foreign actors, planning coordinated attacks. Major cities, infrastructure. I've got names, bank accounts, everything needed to stop it. It's all in my head. It has to get to my command. "It will," Maggie said firmly. "Because you're going to tell them yourself." "Mrs. Reeves, Maggie," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I need you to understand. If I die, if I don't make it out of this cabin, you have to find a way. You have to get word to JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. Tell them Captain Ethan Cross, Delta Force, Operation Nightfall. Tell them the cell is called Crimson Hand. Tell them to look at Senator Morrison's Chief of Staff, a man named Vance. He's the American connection, the money man. That information alone will be enough to start unraveling everything." Maggie grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "You're going to tell them, not me. You. I'm serious." "So am I," Maggie interrupted, and now there were tears on her face, hot and furious. "You listen to me, Captain Ethan Cross. My husband was a soldier for 30 years. I watched him train men like you. I watched him send you out on impossible missions. I watched him bury the ones who didn't come home. And you know what he told me? He told me that the thing that separates special operations soldiers from everyone else isn't that you're stronger or faster or smarter. It's that you refuse to quit. When every rational person would give up, when the odds are impossible, when your body is screaming at you to just stop, you keep going. That's what makes you Delta Force." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. "So you don't get to quit on me. Your job isn't done. Those terrorists are still out there. That intelligence is still in your head. Your country still needs you. And I'll be damned if I dragged you out of a blizzard, stitched you back together twice, and fought off a team of mercenaries just to have you give up now." Ethan stared at her, and something shifted in his expression. The acceptance faded, replaced by something harder: determination. The will to survive that had carried him through a dozen impossible missions. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger. "You're right. I'm not done." "No, you're not. But I need to. I need to make sure. The emergency beacon, it's in my vest. The inner pocket, it's military grade, encrypted GPS. But I need to activate the distress function, the one that says I need immediate evac, that this is life or death." Maggie found the device. It was small, ruggedized, with a simple interface. Ethan walked her through it, his voice steadier now, focused on the mission. She pressed the sequence of buttons, and a red light began flashing. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a signal was screaming into the military satellite network. "Man down. Officer needs immediate extraction. All assets respond. Now we wait," Ethan said. "Now we wait," Maggie agreed. The hours that followed were the longest of Maggie's life. She kept vigil beside Ethan, monitoring his pulse, his breathing, his temperature. She changed his dressings when they soaked through. She gave him water, small sips, keeping him hydrated. She talked to him, keeping him engaged, keeping him conscious. She told him about James, about their 43 years together, about the challenges of being a military wife, about the pride and the fear that came with loving a soldier. She told him about the day James had brought Ranger home, a young military working dog being retired early due to an injury. How James had said the dog needed someone who understood him. How Ranger had become her companion, her protector, her connection to the military life she'd lived for so long. Ethan, in turn, told her about Atlas, about finding the young Malinois at a training facility, about their first mission together in Syria, about the way Atlas had saved his life more than once, detecting IEDs, alerting to ambushes, fighting beside him in close quarters, about how military working dogs weren't just tools or weapons, but partners, brothers in arms. "He's a good dog," Maggie said, looking at Atlas, who was now resting his head on Ethan's leg, keeping watch even in exhaustion. "The best," Ethan agreed. As dawn gave way to morning, Maggie's exhaustion caught up with her. She dozed in her chair, the rifle across her lap, jerking awake every time Ethan shifted or the dogs stirred. But the mercenaries didn't return. Kozlov had retreated, regrouping, planning his next move. Or maybe he'd decided the cost was too high. 3 of his men captured or wounded, vehicles disabled, facing an enemy that refused to die. Maybe he was cutting his losses, but Maggie didn't believe that. Men like Kozlov didn't give up. They adapted. It was mid-afternoon when Ranger's head snapped up. His ears swiveled, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Atlas, despite his injuries, pushed himself to his feet, his own growl joining Ranger's. Maggie grabbed the rifle, her heart pounding. "They're back," but Ethan, listening with the trained ear of a soldier, shook his head. "No, that's not ground vehicles. That's rotors, helicopters." Maggie rushed to the window, and her breath caught. Coming over the ridge, flying low and fast, were 2 Black Hawk helicopters, military, bearing the unmistakable markings of the United States Army. And behind them, higher up, a third helicopter. This one was different, sleeker, bristling with weapons. An attack helicopter, Apache, providing overwatch. They came, Maggie breathed. Your people came. Ethan's face, for the first time since she'd found him, broke into a genuine smile. They always do. The helicopters circled once, assessing the area, then one of them began to descend, landing in the clearing beside Maggie's cabin. The rotor wash sent up clouds of snow, and before the skids had even fully touched down, the side doors were sliding open and soldiers were pouring out. These weren't regular army. Maggie could see it immediately in the way they moved, in their equipment, in the quiet, lethal professionalism of their actions. Special Operations, Delta Force, Ethan's brothers, come to bring him home. The lead operator, a man built like a tank with a face that looked carved from granite, came through Maggie's front door with his rifle up, clearing the room in 2 seconds. His eyes landed on Ethan, and his expression shifted from combat readiness to visible relief. "Cross, you stubborn son of a bitch," he said, lowering his weapon. "You scared the hell out of us." "Good to see you too, Mason," Ethan said weakly. Mason, a Master Sergeant Maggie would later learn, turned to her. His eyes took in everything: the blood, the makeshift medical supplies, the defensive preparations, the elderly woman holding a hunting rifle like she knew how to use it. "Ma'am, I'm Master Sergeant Mason. We're here to extract Captain Cross. Are you Margaret Reeves?" "I am." "Ma'am, you saved his life." The beacon gave us his location, but when we saw the state of that vehicle, when we saw the evidence of a firefight here, we thought we'd be recovering a body. What you did, what you and your dog did, that's the kind of courage that gets medals. Maggie set down the rifle, suddenly feeling every one of her 71 years. "I did what anyone would do." "No, ma'am," Mason said gently. "You did what a soldier would do, and on behalf of Captain Cross and the entire unit, thank you." The next hour was controlled chaos. A combat medic, a man who'd done tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, took over Ethan's care. He examined the wounds, looked at Maggie's field dressings, and gave a low whistle. "Ma'am, this is some of the best emergency trauma care I've seen outside a forward surgical team. You saved his life. He'd have bled out without this." They stabilized Ethan further, started blood transfusions, prepared him for transport. But before they loaded him onto the stretcher, he grabbed Maggie's hand. "Mrs. Reeves, Maggie, thank you. For everything. For not leaving me in that storm. For fighting beside me. For refusing to let me quit." Maggie squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "You take care of yourself, Captain, and you take care of that dog." "I will. And I'll be back. I promise. When this is all over, when the mission is complete, I'm coming back. I'll hold you to that." They carried Ethan out to the helicopter, Atlas limping beside the stretcher on his splinted leg, refusing to be separated from his handler. The medic scooped up the Malinois, carrying him gently into the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted off, Maggie stood in her doorway, Ranger beside her, and watched them disappear over the mountains. But the day wasn't over. Within an hour, more helicopters arrived. Federal agents, FBI, and military police. They arrested the wounded mercenaries Ethan and Maggie had incapacitated. They processed the scene, collecting evidence, documenting everything. And then came the man in the suit. He introduced himself as Agent Bradley, Homeland Security. He sat with Maggie at her kitchen table, recorded her statement, and when she told him everything, when she relayed the information Ethan had given her about Crimson Hand and Senator Morrison's chief of staff, his face went pale. "Mrs. Reeves, the intelligence you just provided, combined with what Captain Cross carries, this is going to prevent a catastrophic attack. Multiple attacks. You understand that, right? You and Captain Cross just saved thousands of lives." A week later, the news broke. Coordinated arrests across 6 states. A domestic terror cell dismantled. The ringleader, a man named Vance, who'd been hiding in plain sight as a high-ranking political staffer, taken into custody. weapons caches seized. Attack plans stopped before they could be executed. The news called it the biggest domestic terrorism bust in a decade. And in a private ceremony at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Margaret Reeves was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Valor, the highest civilian honor the Department of Defense could bestow. She stood in her best dress, feeling awkward and out of place among the generals and colonels, as the secretary himself pinned the medal to her chest and told her that her courage had exemplified the very best of American values. But the moment that mattered most came 3 months later. Maggie was in her garden, pulling weeds, Ranger dozing in the afternoon sun, when she heard a vehicle coming up her long driveway. She straightened, shading her eyes, and her breath caught. It was a truck, and driving it, looking healthy and whole, was Captain Ethan Cross. Beside him in the passenger seat, alert and fully healed, was Atlas. Maggie dropped her gardening gloves and walked down to meet them. Ethan climbed out, moving without pain now, his injuries nothing but scars and memories. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but he still moved like a soldier. "You came back," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promised, didn't I?" Ethan smiled. "I don't break promises to the woman who saved my life." Atlas jumped down from the truck, his leg fully healed, and immediately went to Ranger. The 2 dogs greeted each other like old friends, tails wagging, play-bowing, then settling together in the grass like they'd never been apart. "I'm on leave," Ethan said. 30 days. And I was hoping, if you didn't mind, that Atlas and I could spend some of it here. I owe you about 1,000 conversations, some help around the cabin, and maybe a few lessons on how to be as tough as you are." Maggie laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't had in years. "Captain Cross, you're welcome here any time, for as long as you want. This cabin has room, and I think Ranger would riot if you tried to take Atlas away again." They walked back to the cabin together, the soldier and the widow, the 2 dogs running ahead, and as they sat on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the mountains, Ethan told her the rest, how the intelligence he'd carried had stopped 17 planned attacks, how Crimson Hand was destroyed, how the people he'd fought so hard to stop would never hurt anyone again. "You did that," Maggie said. "You and your unit." "We did that," Ethan corrected. "You, me, Atlas, Ranger. We're a team, and I've been thinking, I'm getting too old for field ops. The body doesn't bounce back the way it used to. I'm transitioning to a training role, and I'm looking for a place to live. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with mountains and space and good people." Maggie looked at him, understanding dawning. "Somewhere like Glacier Ridge?" "Somewhere exactly like Glacier Ridge, if that would be all right with you." "Captain Cross, I'd like nothing better." And so, in the months that followed, a new chapter began. Ethan bought a small cabin 2 miles down the road from Maggie's, close enough to be neighbors, far enough to respect privacy. He became part of the community, the quiet veteran who helped the elderly with repairs, who volunteered at the school, who trained his dog and Maggie's dog together in the mountains. And Maggie, the widow who'd lost her husband and thought her life's adventure was over, found a new purpose. She and Ethan started a program teaching wilderness survival and emergency medical care to local residents, using Ranger and Atlas as therapy and education dogs. They taught people how to be prepared, how to help others, how courage wasn't the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it. On the anniversary of that terrible night, Ethan and Maggie stood together on her porch, the 2 dogs at their feet, and looked out at the mountains that had nearly killed them both. "You know what I learned that night?" Ethan said quietly. "I learned that the strongest warriors aren't always the ones with the weapons and the training. Sometimes they're the ones with the heart to fight for someone else, even when it costs them everything." "And I learned," Maggie said, her hand finding his, "that even when you think your war is over, even when you think you've given all you can give, there's always one more battle worth fighting, one more life worth saving, one more person worth standing beside." They stood there as the sun set, Two souls who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and forged a bond that nothing could break. A soldier and a widow, a German shepherd and a Malinois, a family not born of blood, but of sacrifice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds formed when people refuse to leave each other behind. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, that age is just a number when your spirit refuses to quit, then please share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in these stories. And in the comments below, tell us, would you have walked into that storm? Would you have fought to save a stranger? Let us know. We read every single comment. And remember, heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear gardening gloves and carry the strength of a lifetime of love and loss. Sometimes they're 71 years old with silver hair and a loyal dog. Sometimes they're exactly like Margaret Reeves. May we all have her courage when our moment comes. Type Amen if you believe that the measure of a person isn't in how they live during peace, but in how they fight when everything falls apart. Thank you for listening to this story. God bless you, and may you always find the strength to walk into the storm when someone needs saving.